Hello everyone, my name is Dimitri. I'm IAB Europe Sustainability Lead, and today I'll be going through a brief overview of our newly launched Open Greenhouse Gas Utility. This utility has been developed to support the work of the Framework and Methodology Working Group, and is now being made available through a beta test for all IAB Europe members. The working group is focused on developing the data and guidance required to apply the global media sustainability framework that was developed by AdNet with our support. We are looking at digital channels, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to use the Open Greenhouse Gas Utility, what are the different stages of models built on the platform, what are the different data inputs required, as well as the different features that we have added. Before that, just a few notes. First, as I mentioned, this beta is now open to all IAB Europe members, so kindly refer to the relevant announcement for contact details if you're interested in participating. Second of all, a lot of the information I'm going to mention is already included in the help section, so please do go through that if you have any questions. Perhaps you'll find an answer there. Thirdly, more detailed information about the methodological decisions made to create this utility will be made available and discussed within the Framework and Methodology Working Group. And finally, these decisions, as well as the default values that we are making available, are currently preliminary and pending validation from subject matter experts from across the industry. That being said, I think we're ready to begin and create a new model for a digital advertising campaign. For now, we're going to take the example of a campaign centered on tourism. When we create a new model, we select two things. First of all, which default value set is used for this model. Whenever a specific data input is left blank, the utility will pull the relevant point from the default value set. The default value set is a config parsable file with a specific structure, and that also enables the creation of other standard default value sets. We also select which stages are included in the campaign, although this is a feature that may or may not remain within the tool depending on the demand for modular models. Now that we have created this model, we'll go to the open screen and we'll load it. This is a very important step that's very easy to forget. The loading screen is also where we are able to delete different sections and stages from the model. The first stage is creative production. Under the framework, this section accounts for the storage of assets associated with a campaign. So we're looking at the assets that are produced through a shoot, for example, and then used to create ad experiences for the campaign. Let's assume that we've worked with Butterfly Creative, a creative agency that's based in Portugal, and that 250 gigabytes of assets were produced through the shoot. That's the weight of assets that is then stored for a specific amount of time, which in this case we'll presume to be 3 years. Something important to keep in mind here, even if we don't have figures available that describe the energy intensity of this storage, we can leave it blank in this case, as you can see highlighted in bold, exactly because we have made a default available. The reason we do this is to enable applications of the framework, even in cases where there might be a bottleneck associated with data availability. So while I leave this blank, I can still press add and have the emissions associated with the storage represented as part of the model. Note that you cannot do this with every data entry, but only the specific ones that are described in bold on every screen. Next is selection. Selection is mainly about media owners and the programmatic paths that connect media supply and media demand. So in each section we add under selection, we'll be adding information about publishers and the programmatic supply chain. Let's assume that in this case, we were focused on the German market and specifically working with inventory from an imaginary media owner called Travel Guide Germany. Let's assume that 100,000 impressions were facilitated, and then that through an RFI process, we were able to determine that 300 active paths are present. The avail ratio, the request ratio, and the response ratio will leave blank in this case. Let's say that those aren't figures that were made available, and they will be drawn again from the default dataset. Now that we have added selection, it's time to move on to delivery. Delivery is really about the assets that are sent through, whether these be creative assets like images or other assets like players, like JavaScript, and also the networks over which they are delivered. So in this case, let's say we're referring again to our audience in Germany, 100,000 impressions. And the payload here will assume to be 400 kilobytes. It's important to keep track of the specific units of measurement for each entry. For example, in the creative production stage, we're dealing with gigabytes, simply because the scale is different when we're comparing the output of a shoot and the payload associated with an ad experience. We'll make sure to add the right location, that is to represent the grid intensity of Germany rather than Greece. And finally, looking at fixed and mobile, these are ratios that represent how many of these impressions are facilitated through fixed networks versus mobile networks. So if it's 75% fixed and 25% mobile, it's going to be 0.75 here and 0.25 here. With that, we can now move over to consumption. Consumption is really about the user device. And within the tool, we have 4 standard types: mobile, tablet, PC, and TV. Let's assume that in this case, about 80K were reached on mobile and 20K were reached on tablets. So first of all, we'll begin with mobiles in Germany. We'll assume that the payload is 400 kilobytes, and view time, let's assume that's about 3 seconds. 80,000 impressions, as I mentioned. And then finally, this is Germany. Now, to add the tablet impressions, it's as simple as changing these 2 data entries. And let's also assume that we have actuals that show that the ad experience is a bit more successful on tablet. We have users staying on the ad for another second extra. So now we have added both the mobiles and the tablets that we are accounting for. Finally, corporate overhead. Now, corporate overhead is an inherently flexible section, and it was built to be flexible. It's flexible by design. The idea here is that we can include portions of non-media emissions that come from enterprise-level reporting across the value chain. So for example, going after the example also provided in the description, let's assume that an agency provides a corporate sustainability report that says, well, for every FTE we assign to your contract, that's about 250 grams of CO2 per year. So that will be the intensity figure, 250, and the allocation metric will be 5, if we assume that 5 employees are assigned to the account. This can change. This could be dollars. This could be anything really, because it's built to be flexible by design, as I mentioned. We'll be issuing more specific guidance with respect to what metrics are supposed to be used here, looking at things like which are more accurate, more representative, but also which organizations' enterprise level totals are supposed to be reflected as part of a standard campaign model. Now that we have added everything and essentially populated our model with data, we can move over to the results screen. And here we have a very laconic display of the emissions produced by different parts of this model. So looking at creative production, we can see the emissions total. Looking at selection, we have the emissions totals disaggregated by 2 factors. First of all, network versus data center emissions, and second of all, embodied versus use phase. When we're talking about use phase emissions, this is emissions arising from electricity consumption. Embodied, we're looking at manufacturing and end of life for either devices or networks. Delivery, we have a disaggregation by use phase and embodied emissions again, as well as under consumption, we see the same thing. only here we also separate emissions between the emissions the emissions caused by the device loading, that is the data transfer itself and maintaining an active connection, as well as the energy consumption required for the device to render the ad experience. So we're looking at the energy required to power the screen and actually display the ad. Finally, you can also note that at the end we have the corporate overhead emissions that we included, as well as a total emissions count for each category and a total emissions count for the campaign at the top. Up here, you can also see what defaults file has been used for this model, which is really useful for record keeping purposes and to understand, what exactly the differences are with respect to using different defaults files. An extra feature that we have added in the tool is this defaults editor right here. Now, this might appear quite complicated because it's really lacking documentation with respect to what individual field does, but this will be used within the Framework and Methodology Working Group in collaboration with our national federations to look at how we can localize default value sets based on two factors. First of all, where there is a substantial difference between markets when it comes to some of these elements. So if we look at programmatic, for example, and we look at active paths, if on average they differ significantly between markets, that might be something that requires further investigation. And second of all, what is the material impact on the emissions total? So even if a data point diverges significantly between markets, if it doesn't really matter in terms of the overall emissions count, it's not likely to warrant localization. But if it does, then that means that in order to achieve a robust estimation, we really do need to look at what that value needs to be for a particular market. Finally, just to showcase how you can edit your models after they've been created, I can go back to the open model screen and delete mobiles in Germany, which I now realize should have been called tablets in Germany. That is it in terms of a brief overview of the tool. As I said, a lot of this information can also be found in the help section, and the IAB Europe team is available to hear your feedback and answer your questions. Thank you.